was that? Yeah, I'm not sure that everybody needs to be able to hear me breathing. Has that changed it? It's changed it a little bit. Okay, right. Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome all members of the public, councillors, parish representatives and officers to the Planning Committee. This meeting is being streamed live and it is capable of repeated viewing. Could I ask everyone to note the fire safety instruction that on hearing the alarm you should leave the building by the nearest marked exit and congregate at the assembly point in the car park. Also, please switch all electronic devices being used to silent. My name is Councillor Philip Minor and I am the Chair. On my left is the Vice Chair, Councillor Martin Cuthbert. The co-opted parish councillors are situated along the second row of benches. Members of the Planning Committee sit on the front row of benches and only those councillors who are members of the Planning Committee are entitled to vote. For clarity, as we go through the agenda this evening, members of the committee will be permitted to speak for up to 5 minutes on each item. Any other members and parish councillors will be permitted a maximum of 3 minutes to speak with permission from the Chair. May I remind members to declare any pecuniary or non-pecuniary interests and the nature of the interest at the beginning of an agenda item, and that on declaring a pecuniary interest you are required to leave the meeting when that item of business is considered. I would like to remind non-voting members of the committee that they should notify the Chair in advance if they wish to speak on an item. That's what the Constitution says. If the Chair agrees they will be included as official speakers, I have generally been happy to include people. However, they would not be permitted to participate in the debate once the item is under discussion. There should be no interaction from public areas at any time during the meeting. Members of the public invited to speak on tonight's applications will only be permitted to speak for 3 minutes if they have indicated to do so in advance as a representative or as an applicant agent on specific applications. And requests to speak should have been received by the clerk by yesterday at 4 o'clock. In the event of a disturbance such as a calling out from the public area during the meeting, a request from the Chair to be quiet will be given. But if the problem persists, any persons interrupting the meeting will be asked to leave. If necessary, the meeting will be adjourned to allow this to take place. So, the first item of business is apologies for absence. Mrs O'Borman, have any apologies been received?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Apologies have been received from Councillors Gelder Bloom and Councillor Dr Tim Barrett. Councillors Chinnery and Councillor Gareth Barrett are substituting. Apologies have also been received from Councillor McShane.
Thank you for that, Mrs O'Borman. The second item is the minutes of the meeting of the Planning Committee, which was held in December, with the Ingatstone Hall application. An amendment has been made to the minutes to state that Councillor McShane moved and Councillor Gorton seconded on this application, and not, as it states in the minutes, Councillors Minor and Councillor Cuthbert. I'd also just like to comment that it's courteous and it's the normal process to give apologies for non-attendance before the meeting. That's the way it's normally done. It's not written in the Constitution, but that's the way it's normally done. Are these minutes agreed? Agreed? Right. So we move to declarations of interest. Are there any declarations to be made at this time? Councillor Quirk.
Yeah, Chairman, sorry, am I standing up? This isn't for councillors, so I don't need to. I can stay seated. Right, good, okay, slightly more informal. Chairman, yes, item 5, I would like to declare a non-pecuniary interest on the basis that the applicant is known to me, a previous business relationship, not financial and not relating to a planning matter, but I'll just declare that just to be on the safe side, if I may.
Thank you for that, Councillor Quirk. That's very helpful and very open. Right, the committee will now determine the planning applications and matters before it. Before we begin, may I just remind those members of the public who will be addressing the committee on planning applications tonight that your speech should be no longer than 3 minutes in duration and should relate purely to planning matters. When your name is called, will you please make your way to the chair provided. When you have completed your speech, the committee will debate the application and reach a decision. Right, now, the first thing we need to say is, for the committee and members of the public to note that the notice has been made public, But item 6, which is on this agenda tonight, which is land at Priest Lane in Priest Lane, Brentwood, has been withdrawn from tonight's agenda. So updated comments from housing can be provided to this committee. Officers are of the view that further details are required before this application is determined at a future planning committee. We are hoping that it will come to the February planning committee, which is less than a month away. So the legal representative has advised that this is a sensible course of action, and if anybody has any questions or queries, then please contact Claire Mayhew after the meeting. So I'm also like to move a motion under 8.1c of the Constitution to vary the order of the agenda, and that involves hearing item 5, which is the development of the site adjacent to 77 Hutton, Mount Avenue, Hutton, before item 4, which is the 15 Coleridge Walk application. So we've taken out item 6, and we would like to discuss item 5 before item 4. For this, I need a seconder. Do I have a seconder?
Happy to second that.
Is this variation agreed by members?
Agreed.
So, as a result of all of that, we are moving to item 5, which is for the development of the site adjacent to 77 Mount Avenue in Hutton. And this is an application for construction of a detached 3-bedroom bungalow. This is application number 25/01085/FUL. The recommendation is for approval, and the case officer is Mr. Darrell Cook. Mr. Cook.
Thank you, Chair. This slide illustrates the site location plan as well as an aerial photograph of the site with an approximate red line boundary. The red arrow on the right-hand side illustrates where the site is located on the Google Earth image. Just a couple of updates to start off with. For members' benefits, I've illustrated the relevant ward boundaries. The application site is within Hutton East, but the means of access would be via Hutton South. In terms of the report itself, 6.6 of the report talks about the Council's current housing land supply position. Just so members are aware that the Council have now published revised information that we can now demonstrate 5.18 years. Also, members will be aware that a revised condition schedule was circulated to members this afternoon, outlining some minor amendments to condition wording following input from the Council's legal advisor. This is to provide clarity and precision. As part of those changes, it's also recommended that condition 26, which is a condition which effectively states that materials shall be stored clear of the highway, should be advisory only, and therefore it's recommended to be deleted and just put on as an informative. This application has been referred by Councillor Gibson. The referral reason is located on the screen and at the start of the agenda item. I summarise this as concerns in relation to the site's planning history, which includes multiple reasons for refusal, appeals, concerns over the impact of a new building on the local character, amenities of neighbours by way of overlooking, as well as the impacts upon the living conditions of any future occupants of the site from being overlooked, as well as highway safety concerns and surface water drainage issues. The report considers these in detail. 10 neighbour representations were received for this application objecting to the scheme. The key material themes are on screen and addressed within the report. No objection has been received by consultees, and they recommend that conditions are imposed where appropriate. The Highways Officer, for example, considers there is suitable parking provision and an acceptable access for the new development. The Council's Ecology Officer concludes there's no material impact on trees or wildlife. Environmental Health recommend some precautionary conditions to provide mitigation during construction. The applicant, prior to submission of this scheme, undertook extensive pre-application advice with the council. That involved specialist independent advice from the council's urban design officer to consider whether a scheme would be supported by officers. For completeness, they have been consulted on this scheme and they provided some consultative feedback. They're also present this evening to assist members if there's any detailed design or contextual questions that may be helpful. Again, We've received a further representation today. This primarily relates to some ongoing construction activity nearby at number 75 and the effects of future development on the amenities and living conditions of neighbouring properties. What I would say in response is that there is always going to be a degree of disruption from construction activity, and that this can be mitigated through condition. Condition 6, for example, refers to the need for a construction method statement. Officers do not consider that the matters raised meet the threshold required to justify a reason for refusal on the basis of highway impacts. This slide illustrates 3 aerial images showing the site in its context. The top right image helps to provide a greater understanding of site levels. Members will note that the house to the right hand side of this image is set, or to the top on screen, is set at a high ground level. Members would have noticed that on site on Saturday. The bottom right hand side image shows the pedestrian only access to the east of the application site, and that this is not a through road. This slide includes a selection of the wider context, including dwelling houses within Mount Avenue, the top 3 images, and those that are further afield. The purpose is purely to illustrate that there is a variety of building forms, including a mix of 2.5 stories, as well as bungalows. There is also variation in terms of external materials, brickwork, render, cladding, and also the provision of green roofs. This slide shows images from outside the front of the application site, as well as to the east towards the pedestrian access at Hanging Hill Lane. This slide shows images from within the application site from Saturday morning. There are various land levels within, as it slopes up towards the rear and north eastern corner. The images on the left-hand side are as you enter into the site from the centrally located access, with number 184 Hanging Hill Lane to the rear. That should show there. The image to the top right shows a view towards the substation and number 77 Mount Avenue, and the image to the bottom right shows the shared boundaries behind the hedgerow of Hanging Hill Lane. So before I go on to show the new scheme before members, I think it's important to consider the relevant context, and the following few slides will provide a summary of earlier applications at this site, including why applications were refused and providing selected drawings to illustrate the nature of each scheme. Members should know that all of these schemes are larger in scale than the proposed development, which is materially different to earlier submissions in both scale and design, with excavation in this case proposed. Nearly all of the earlier schemes predate the current local plan and the updated National Planning Policy Framework. Therefore, it is important, as outlined within the report, that this scheme is considered afresh. Through policy changes, there is an even greater emphasis on making efficient use of land, redeveloping sites within the established settlements rather than in the countryside, and obviously in order to maintain our 5-year housing land supply and delivery. So on this slide, there are 2 schemes. The first was a 2002 outline application, which was dismissed on appeal. The reasons are summarised on screen. There are no drawings on that application, so nothing to illustrate here. The second scheme in 2008 does have drawings, and that illustrates a 2-storey dwelling house. That also included a garage, which you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. That projected quite significantly forward of the front building line. There are also concerns raised regarding overlooking and the loss of trees. Just to kind of provide continuity, I suppose, between each scheme, I've put a blue dashed line showing the heights of the immediate built form at both sides of the application site, so you can kind of get consistency, understanding heights, and then when we move on to look at the actual scheme. So 2010 scheme was withdrawn. The 2013 application was refused on grounds regarding detrimental impacts upon the character and appearance of the area, which was subsequently dismissed on appeal. Concerns were also raised regarding the living conditions of future occupants through overlooking because of the site levels. The 2015 scheme was refused on similar grounds and also dismissed on appeal, with the increased height also considered to result in overlooking of the rear neighbour at 184 and for a combination of built form and outdoor seating areas, which would require fencing to screen, would amount to overbearing effects to the detriment of number 77, the property to the left-hand side. In 2016, a scheme again was refused on similar grounds, despite a reduction in built form. Most recently, in 2024, a new scheme was submitted of a contemporary appearance. However, many of the earlier issues were identified, and despite the principle of residential development being acceptable to officers as set out, the scheme is still not supported. So moving on, this slide shows the proposed layout of the building in comparison to neighbours. It broadly follows the same building lines to the front and rear immediately adjacent number 77. This slide illustrates the proposed layout of the building as well as the floor plan. So the image to the left is the block plan illustrating parking provision to the front, and for a series of retaining walls due to the excavation that is proposed. Private amenity courtyards are located at the front and rear of the building to provide screening from neighbouring properties to ensure that the living conditions of future occupants are protected. Built form is also situated off the boundaries to maintain the privacy of existing and future residents. The scheme is contemporary in nature with green roofs provided, whilst existing hedging is sought to be retained along the common boundaries, in addition to new planting. The image to the right illustrates the bungalow accommodation with 3 bedrooms, each overlooking a courtyard area, plus open living arrangements to towards the right-hand side of the floor plan. Cycle storage and bin storage provision is at the front courtyard. Vegetation and boundary treatments are proposed on all sides surrounding the site, and as I said, the courtyard is sunken towards the rear as part of the excavation, with the retaining wall providing some additional screening, as well as the built form itself. So this image illustrates the street scene and section drawing. The street scene with neighbouring properties to either side clearly shows the built form significantly lower than those preceding schemes, with the design intent for the scheme to visually blend into the landscape whilst using materials which are contextually appropriate to context. The red outlines also help to denote the intended level of excavation required to ensure the living arrangements do not result in overlooking effects, either from within the site, looking out towards neighbouring properties, but also from the neighbouring properties surrounding. The table on screen also provides a few dimensions. This slide shows the east-facing elevation, located adjacent numbers 180 and 182, Hanging Hill Lane boundaries. A new 2-metre closed-boarded fence is proposed with the hedgerow to be retained. The built form is mostly below this fence level, as can be seen on slide, and the boundary treatment at 2 metres high would restrict overlooking into the site boundary, plus obviously there's the built form too, which provides screening of the private amenity areas for future occupants. This slide illustrates the side elevation, west facing, adjacent number 77. The fenestration opening in the middle serves bedroom 2, with new fencing proposed again at 2 metres high along those edges. There's also hedgerows also being proposed around that side too. To the rear, north facing, adjacent to number 184, is the image to the bottom of the screen. Again, a 2-metre fence is proposed, and as you can see, the built form is sunken into the ground. The following slides illustrate some 3D visuals that have been provided to illustrate the scheme. These images show the development from the southern side at the point of access, both from the parking area and a kind of more aerial type view, bottom right. Again, this image shows an aerial view of the built form in relation to the neighbouring sites. So you can see that there are green roofs proposed, retaining wall elements, built form providing screening of private amenity areas. This slide shows the rear garden area. Again, the courtyard is sunken behind a retaining wall to help maintain the privacy of future occupants and also to ensure that there is no overlooking of neighbouring properties. This slide illustrates the material palette for the proposed scheme during the lifetime of the application. In direct response to consultee feedback, the palette of materials was amended to include red brickwork and timber cladding to ensure the scheme is contextually appropriate in lieu of provision of stone walls. Stone wall use is still retained, but only towards the rear of the built form, so it is not publicly visible. There will also be living walls and green roofs incorporated, which is strongly supported given the overall design intent. So, in summary, the application must be considered afresh given earlier proposals as it differs in design. The overall impact upon the character and appearance of the area is considered to be acceptable. The density is considered to be acceptable within this context. It's very similar to those in the immediate vicinity, and it wouldn't be there wouldn't be a difference of density perceptible from the public realm, given it's just for one house. The site is considered to be within a sustainable location. The amenity provision of neighbouring properties and for future occupants is considered to be acceptable. There will be hedgerows and fencing erected to provide screening. There are no concerns in relation to ecology. Conditions to mitigate construction effects are recommended. The proposal is not considered to give rise to an adverse surface water flood risk. Sub-features are proposed as illustrated within the submission, and there is satisfactory parking provision with no highways objection in respect of the suitability of the access, with full details to be provided through condition. So on that basis, the recommendation is for approval. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that. Councillor Quirk, you will have an opportunity to speak. Is there a reason for you speaking now?
Yes, there is, just to save the committee and the public some time. I will be seeking to move a motion for deferral on the basis that I don't think enough opportunity has been afforded to residents nearby to come prepared to this meeting to make representations. I'm just thinking about trying to save the committee and the public time. If I have a seconder for that, with your indulgence, Chairman, perhaps we can discuss that just to save the inconvenience, particularly of Hutton Mountain Association and whoever else you've got to speak, including ward members.
Happy to second that.
Right. Okay, well, we will go through the process that we've embarked upon. We've obviously had the officer presentation. We will have the speakers who can speak. They will have the opportunity to speak, and then we can discuss your motion for deferral. So, the first person to speak, Mr Gordon. Councillor Hurst, you'll have an opportunity in a minute.
Just a point of information, Chair, if I may. I mean, the reason for asking for deferral is that those who have actually put their names down to speak have not had time to prepare, because I believe the notifications were sent out by post and never delivered. So those who are here know, because those in the ward councillors have informed them it's happening, and they haven't therefore had time to prepare. So if you're going to ask them to speak, you won't be hearing them at their best.
You understand that. You have also, in the exchange of emails that's taken place, you've also been informed that the process that the council has gone through as far as this application is the completely normal process that it goes through on any application. So if there are residents who didn't know that this was going on, it's obviously very unfortunate and something's gone wrong. But in terms of what you've been told from the officer end and the council end, the process that the council has undertaken has been the completely normal process. So you will notice that we've already had a slide which was added into the officer presentation, which came from a neighbour. I'm happy to accept Mr Gordon having an opportunity to speak now, even though he didn't notify the council by 4 o'clock yesterday, which is not the normal process, but I'm happy to allow him to speak. So what I'm trying to do is give those who want to speak, first of all, we had the opportunity of something was added into the officer report. Secondly, a resident who otherwise wouldn't have been able to speak, if we were going to be abiding by the letter of the Constitution, happy to allow a resident to speak. So at this point, I'm bending over backwards in order to give residents and neighbours the opportunity to have their say. So we'll go through the process and we can discuss a motion for deferral, but we'll go through the process. Residents can speak. So the first person to speak is Mr Gordon.
Mr. Chairman, councillors, thank you for giving me the opportunity to say a few words. Unfortunately, it might be a bit garbled, as I only found out over the weekend about this meeting and have had very, very little time to prepare. I've made a few notes. Just to go back to the 2002 application, which was refused on appeal by the Secretary of State, and I quote, "Not even a single-storey dwelling could overcome the problem of overlooking, and together with the removal of any part of the bank, would have an urbanising effect and harm the character and appearance of this area. It is nonsense to suggest that this proposal of a large bungalow, roof gardens, and literally no outside space or garden would not affect neighbouring properties. I know traffic and building works are really not a planning consideration, but hopefully many of you have seen the area. There is absolutely no room. The proposal only allows for 2 parking spaces if the bungalow is built. Where are all the lorries are going to park? Where are all the workmen's cars going to park? It's a single track. The damage to everyone's neighbouring property will be immense. The verges will be churned up, trees will be damaged, trees with TPOs will never be replaced. And for what? For a bungalow that has already been refused by the Secretary of State. Again, in 2014, I think one of the planning inspector's recommendations was not even a single dwelling should or could be suggested or recommended for this site. It is totally inappropriate. Highways in other applications have asked for visibility displays. I can't understand why they should have no issues with this. 500 school children a day walk past this site, up a hill, coming down on bikes, coming down on scooters. With all this traffic, there will be a tragedy waiting to happen because there is no room for anything. The loss of foliage, the damage to the silver birches that have TPOs, again, immense. Deliveries, how will deliveries get there? There's no room to turn around a normal car, let alone an articulated lorry with bricks and mortar and beams and roofing tiles. We have flooding problems at that end of the road. 75, which is being rebuilt, has been flooded on numerous occasions. My neighbour at 64 has been flooded on numerous occasions. Sewage has poured into their houses and into their gardens. Another building there with all the additional paraphernalia will only increase that issue. I'm still concerned about why this property is designated in a different ward to all its neighbours, given that the only way in and out of this plot is through Mount Avenue. And I'm sure the person who owns it would rather have 79 Mount Avenue than 182A Hanging Hill Lane. So I would recommend and would plead with you to refuse this. We've had over 20 years of applications, most of which have been totally unsuitable, and I don't believe this is any different. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for that. Right, the next person to speak will be the chairperson of the Hutton Mount Association, Sheila Road, is that?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for letting me speak. The points that I raised before this committee meeting, I still stand by. I appreciate the overview, but I think we have some serious issues here. One of the things, and I agree with Mr. Gordon as well in terms of his points that he put forward, one of the things we haven't discussed is where are they going to go, because Mount Avenue is part of a private estate, and as far as I understand, that particular plot doesn't belong to Hutton Mount. It belongs to 2 gardens on Hanging Hill Lane, which is number 180 and 182. I think we are, in terms of the residential density, it's very compact on the piece of land that is available. It doesn't meet the minimum requirement on Hutton Mount either, in terms of being, it's smaller than 0.10 of a hectare. The drive, I agree in terms of there's no visibility as you're coming out of the drive. It's a single lane up at the top. I think we are, in terms of the density, in terms of the green area, we're not protecting the lands for garden. There are 5 courtyards on this property because it's stuck in, I appreciate it's stuck into the ground. But that is one of the areas where we would like to see more greenery. I think overlooking may be covered at this point in time, but going forward, I think a property like that, and I'm not looking at this design, but the way the property is, i.e. a flat roof bungalow, doesn't fit with the situation or where it's situated. It would be beautiful somewhere else, but where it's situated is not ideal for that area. In terms of the parking, there is space for 1 car in the drive. Typically, on the estate, we see that there's a significant number, more than 1 car to a property. But there's no parking opportunity outside of that house because of the single lane. Neither is there all the way down that particular road. So there should be, if anything, you need to have the possibility to potentially park something like 4 or 5 cars in the drive in order to meet the standards that we have on Hutton Mount. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Right. So now next we have the applicant Matt Driscoll.
Good evening, Chair, members. My name is Matt Driscoll, and I'm speaking on behalf of the applicant in support of the application before you. We are aware that this site has a long and complex planning history. There have been several previous applications and dismissed appeals dating back to 2002. However, rather than ignoring those previous refusals, we have used them as a definitive design brief for this proposal. Previous schemes failed because they proposed a conventional multi-storey form onto a site with significant constraints regarding topography and relationships with neighbours. The inspectors have previously ruled that a standard dwelling here would result in unacceptable massing, forward projection and overlooking issues, specifically regarding the relationship with 77 Mount Avenue and the properties on Hanging Hill Lane. This proposal is fundamentally different. It is not an attempt to squeeze a standard house onto the plot. Instead, it is a bespoke single-storey design that works with the challenging topography rather than fighting against it. By utilising a semi-subterranean approach and a tree root plan form, we have virtually eliminated the visual bulk that caused previous refusals. This scheme represents a significant improvement in design quality over earlier iterations. We recognise from the reasons for calling this application in that there might be specific concerns for councillors. First, on the issue of overlooking and privacy, this was the downfall of previous schemes. We have solved this by orientating the living spaces around internal sunken courtyards. This design physically prevents outward views into neighbours' gardens and, crucially, prevents the neighbours in Hanging Hill Lane from looking down into the private amenity space of the new dwelling. The privacy issue is resolved by the architecture itself. Second, regarding access and physical constraints, the Highway Authority has fully reviewed the scheme, including the visibility displays and gradient. They have confirmed that the proposed access is safe and raised no objection subject to the conditions included in the report. Finally, I must address the suggestion that this approval could act as a Trojan horse to pave the way for a more conventional resubmission later. This is simply not the case. The material weight of the previous refusals and appeal decisions remains. Those decisions effectively restrict a standard house on this site. Approving this specific design does not remove the harm associated with the previous proposals. It merely confirms that this specific, high-quality, innovative solution is acceptable where the others were not. This scheme represents a unique opportunity to deliver a high-quality home that respects the constraints of the site. I respectfully ask you to support your officer's recommendation for approval. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Right, so, Councillor Hurst. Yeah, Councillor Hurst first, and I'll come to Councillor Gibson. Unless you want to do it the other way around. If you want to do it the other way around. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Following my referral, I would like to highlight that this application has a long and complex planning history, with multiple refusals over the past 20 years, including dismissals at appeal. Planning inspectors have consistently concluded that the site is unsuitable for development, and the core concerns that are identified remain relevant today. The plot is both very small and steeply sloped, creating fundamental physical constraints. Access continues to rely on a steep, poorly sited entrance, raising ongoing highway safety concerns. While the proposed earth-sheltered design and green roof are cited in support of the application, they do not resolve the underlying issues of access or site suitability. In addition, the specialist nature of the construction raises questions around drainage, engineering feasibility, and long-term deliverability. There's also a strong and sustained local objection, which underlines the seriousness of these concerns for neighbouring residents. For these reasons, I ask the Planning Committee to consider this application very carefully, having regard to the site's planning history, previous inspector conclusions, and the potential impacts on the local area. Given that any development here will be permanent, it is important that members are fully satisfied that the long-standing issues have been properly addressed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that. Councillor Hurst.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for allowing me to speak. I'm not a member of your committee. So we've heard, I think, already about the history. I'm not so sure it's complex. I think it's been fairly simple. It's been said no on several occasions. There is still the issue of design bulk. This site is being very substantially developed. I believe that the officer's presentation of density was somewhat misleading. Of course, since it's a smaller site, it isn't as dense as those larger sites next door to it. But the entirety of this site is to be developed. That means, I think, that the points made in previous applications, against previous applications, around the living conditions are still very much appropriate. There is still a very bulky design, even if not in height, but certainly in terms of depth and scope of the site, which is being proposed here. The discussion around the access, if I can just clarify where we've been before, it's not the fact that you can't get the sight lines. The inspector has previously pointed out that highways have been satisfied with the sight lines. The problem is that providing the sight lines, which are so necessary when hundreds of school kids every day pass this site on foot, the importance of that is really there, but the point is that those sight lines create an urbanising effect, which, as the inspector has previously said, is out of character with this area of Brentwood, indeed with the overall character of Hutton Mount. So the character of the street scene will be negatively impacted by this. We heard that the building line is in line with other building lines. Of the building, yes, but not of the walls around the car parking. And there are no walls around car parking on Hutton Mount. This is again going to be a substantial change in character. You are going to be seeing a dwelling which would be, frankly, innovative, exciting and brilliant in an urban setting, put into a semi-rural setting. And it is going to create that urbanising effect. So we have got size and volume of site being developed. We have non-sustainable living conditions within the terms of the MPPF. We talked about the environment, biodiversity net gain, or net loss, in fact. Apparently that's been mitigated, but it's not being mitigated here. That will be a substantial difference to the character of Hutton Mount, to see this amount of green space simply being taken away. And I note the very nice drawings with green roofs and planting around the walls, but that is not the same as biodiversity net gain or net loss. So overall, I think it's very clear that this development is still very much in breach of Brentwood's local plan, specifically policies BE14, HBO3, NEO1 BE02, BE05 and NE07. On that basis, I would strongly ask the committee to refuse this application.
Thank you, Councillor Hurst. Right, so yeah. So we have Councillor Rigby and we have Councillor Chinnery on the committee. Either of you can go first. Just before we do that, there is a wording in the Constitution which allows people to ask questions of those who have already spoken, because when Councillor Rigby and Councillor Chinnery speak, we're moving into the committee discussion. I actually do have a question, and I think it probably would go to Ms. Rode in terms of Hutton Mount. Possibly somebody else can answer it. There are comments about plot size, and obviously we're also talking about the far end of the road here, which is a dead-end road. But when you look at the area plan that we have in our agenda and some of the images that we've already seen, I didn't notice this before we actually went on the site visit, because I would have had a look at it on the site visit. But it does seem to me that the plot size for number 66 opposite, the plot size for number 70, and I gather number 72 is also a Mount Avenue site, they all seem to be kind of similar to this current plot size. And I'm a little bit curious as to whether some of the concerns that are being expressed about this application were expressed in terms of those sites. So, I mean, if there's anybody who's already spoken who's not on the planning committee who thinks they've got an answer to that, I'm happy to take an answer. But obviously, if Councillor Hurst? Councillor Hurst?
It probably might, Chair, if that's all right. So I think the drawings are a little misleading. The plot sizes of 70 and 72 do satisfy the prior requisite of Hutton Mount development.
Okay.
It does not.
Right, that's, I just wanted to
Chairman,
ask.
sorry, a bit of a point of order. Should we
Councillor-
not be debating my motion to defer?
We're
before we
coming
get
to
into
you. There's a
technicalities?
process, Councillor Quirk. Don't call out. So we now have two ward councillors who have the opportunity to speak at the beginning of the debate who are on the committee. So Councillor Chinnery, Councillor Rigby, who wants to speak first? Councillor Rigby?
Thank you, Chair. I will be speaking on this application, but I won't be voting. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I am a member of your committee, and I urge you to refuse this application. My comments are grounded in long-standing material planning considerations that affect this site. Its constrained size and steep topography, unresolved and unsafe access, harm to much valued local character, flood, drainage and land stability risks, biodiversity loss, unacceptable impacts on amenity and privacy, and serious construction and emergency access concerns. This plot's small size and unusual level changes have repeatedly been found incapable of accommodating a dwelling without causing harm. Those physical constraints remain. Access has previously been judged unsafe. The poor visibility displays have been spoken to by the residents, and the verge issues cannot simply be solved by what I consider to be innovative design tweaks. I'll add that I'm surprised that the property is in Hutton East. It strikes me as wholly anomalous that a property that is in Mount Avenue, one of the most sought-after roads in Hutton South, forms a small exclave in my ward. By rights, it should be Councillors Hurst, Quirk and Slade speaking as the ward councillors on this matter, as the late Councillor Mark Reed would have done. I'm pretty sure he would have said the same, and I say the same for him. And I'd ask the Secretary to minute that I'd like Electoral Services to look at why it is that this remains in Hutton East, and it should be rectified. Moving on, the proposal is cramped and it's incongruous within the green, spacious character of Hutton Mount. It fails, in my view, to reinforce local distinctiveness, and it runs counter to expectations for what I would consider to be design for Hutton Mount. Now, Mount Avenue is a narrow cul-de-sac and it doesn't have a turning head. There have been historic concerns about the safety risks for pedestrians and school children. I drive past this road, this access, every day, okay, and I see hundreds of school children from St Martin's School using it as a means to get to and from the station and beyond. I think there are significant safety risks. I think that there are issues, and those safety impacts are not acceptable to me. Now, I recognise that highways have said differently, and that it's a high bar to cross in terms of rejecting their assessment. But those community concerns are real, and they're real to me, and they're real to the kids. Flooding, drainage and land stability. We've already heard about flooding and sewage issues. It's a steep gradient. Surface water runoff and subsidence risks are going to be heightened. I recognise that the officer has proposed conditions, but without, for me, more unambiguous evidence of satisfactory mitigation, those fundamental risks remain. Now, I acknowledge that the site, to summarise, looks sufficiently innovative to appear on grand designs. Anyone who has watched Kevin MacLeod's magnum opus knows that that can be a tale of woe as much as a tale of wonder, and there I leave it. Given the narrow, dead-end nature of Mount Avenue, I think the point about construction of traffic is very real. It will cause real disruption to residents, it will impede routine services, and there's a risk of hindering emergency services, which, should an accident happen, would be a terrible thing to see. The draft conditions aim to address matters such as ground investigation, landscaping, external lighting, restrictions on roof use, permitted future development, access design and the ubiquitous travel packs, but they cannot and will not overcome the fundamental problems I've talked about. The harm in this development arises from the site's inherent constraints and context, not from a lack of controllable details. This application should be refused as the others were before it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rigby. Councillor Chinnery.
Thank you, Chair. I share the scepticism of Councillor Rigby, and I'd like to thank all of those who have spoken on this application so far. I stand by my decision to second the motion for deferral. I'm happy to debate that, but should that not proceed, I am happy to support a motion to refuse the application on the grounds of B14, 0.5.126. I think the property itself, I don't think anything on Hutton Mount or in the neighbouring Hang Hill Lane area looks like this property, subterranean. I also note the significant concerns of to safety and construction because of the hundreds and hundreds of school children going up and down Mount Avenue. It's not a particularly safe place, and on the grounds of B14 and also NE07, I am minded to support a refusal if we are not deferring this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Chinnery. Right, so we have a motion for deferral which has been moved and seconded.
Can I speak to
Yes, absolutely. Yes,
Thank you,
Councillor
Chair. I'd like to withdraw my motion to defer and move a motion of refusal, which I'd like to speak to.
And I'm assuming Councillor Chinnery is seconding.
Seconds.
Right, okay.
Sorry.
Councillor,
It makes sense now.
Yeah.
Councillor Quirk, speak on your...
If I may, please. Yeah, thank you. Look, so listening to the representations from Hutton Mount Association and indeed from Mr Gordon, ward members and indeed now members of the planning committee, it seems pretty clear that we are very, very uncomfortable with this. And I think for a number of reasons, I won't re-rehearse the reasons that have been put forward, except to say that actually the one that I want to really highlight, which Councillor Chinnery has just mentioned, is NE07. Now, NE07, of course, is effectively a prohibition, if we want to call it that, or a move away from or against what is effectively backland development. Now, the reason actually, to answer the question just now, that the applicant site in question is seen as being Hutton East rather than Hutton South is because the applicant site forms the rear gardens of two properties in Hanging Hill Lane, which of course is in Hutton East. But it's absolutely right to say that of course if this applicant site is in Mount Avenue, Hutton Mount, it is part of Hutton South, as is the house next door, the house opposite, and so on. So look, I am very, very concerned about a number of things, overdevelopment, design, of course, which speaks to B14. Not so much traffic, but certainly where I live in Ridgeway, which is just over the other side of Hutton Mount, I see the plethora of St Martin's school children in and out of that school let's just say, undertaking hijinks on the way in and out of school, and perhaps they don't have quite the regard for moving traffic that they should, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be protected by way of this committee being concerned about their safety and making decisions that would help to avoid some calamity in the future at that particular part of Mount Avenue, given the fact that it is pretty much a pedestrian access to St Martin's School. But I think, despite what the officers say, and with the greatest respect, I think this is overdevelopment. I think the design is entirely out of keeping with Hutton Mount. What Hutton Mount Limited will say about this in terms of covenants and their rules, regulations and guidelines obviously is a matter for them, that's not for this committee. But in particular, if we are to heed what NEO 7 paragraphs B and C both say, which is effectively that the form, height and layout of the proposed development must be appropriate to the surrounding pattern of development and the character of the area. Well, this application, in my view, does not fit that, nor see the amenity and privacy of neighbouring, existing and new residents be protected. I don't think this application achieves that either. So hence my motion to refuse, kindly seconded by Councillor Chinnery. Thank you.
So, Councillor Chinnery, I mean, you've obviously already spoken. Would you like to speak again in the seconding process?
I'm happy. I think what I've said has been said, so happy to move on with the debate.
Right, thanks for that. So we do have our design officer with us. And given that you're obviously expressing and others have been expressing concerns about the design, and the case officer is happy with the design, I think it's worth us going to our design officer and hearing something from the design officer in terms of the opinions on the design.
Thank you, Chair, and members, good evening. I'm happy to take any questions, and I appreciate that design can be very nuanced, and it is obviously a very characterful area. I hope members, as well as having the officer report, have had sight of the very detailed design letters that I've also submitted. I've assessed this independently for the LPA, and I recall all of the applications from 2014 because I have advised on this site before. It is a very challenging site, and that's been said, I think, across the board. But in terms of architecture and in terms of design, what I have advised and what I've come to the conclusion of with this particular site is that where it was the most challenging in terms of its levels, the context, the street scene, the ecology, architecture, particularly in paragraph 135B of the MPPF, we talk about good architecture, and this is quite a silent piece of architecture. It's incredibly intelligent. I'm here purely in urban design terms, members. So what has happened here, what you have here is an architecture that is led completely by its challenges and by its attributes, and it's working inwardly. I agree, and I've heard before with applications on this site, that it is very difficult to place a building on top of these levels. So architecturally, Chair, what the architect has done here is work with the levels and also looked at a new stance on urban ecology and a sustainable building, and that carries weight in national planning policy terms. The design, and I've said in my letter, doesn't seek to mimic any of its neighbouring buildings, and there is quite an eclectic mix, but there is an overriding character in this particular area. What it's gone for is quite, as I said, a silent piece of architecture, but this does not set a precedent. It really does stand on its own, and that's quite a high benchmark in urban design terms. So I would engage paragraph 135B of the National Planning Policy Framework. It does align with the aims of achieving well-designed places, in my professional opinion. And it is a contextually sensitive piece of design, but this, and I say this with great weight, and I think it goes to Councillor Rigby, your point, it is all in the execution. I myself do not watch grand designs, but I think I know what you were saying. This is all a matter of construction and detail and quality. but design can be quite subjective. So I'm happy to impartially answer any questions that members have. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Councillor Barber.
Thank you, Chair. I'm actually glad that we're debating a motion either to refuse or approve rather than to delay and defer. I'm sure that wouldn't achieve a great deal. A couple of comments. Obviously, I give credit to the applicant for trying to address the responses from the inspector on the previous applications, because that's a good thing. I note that the conditions for this, as proposed by the officers, included the removal of permitted development rights, and I think that is to be welcome. I notice also, obviously, it addresses the overlooking issue, but inherently, the application does feel somewhat claustrophobic. On page 31, section 6.14, we refer to the policy HPO3 and say that the scheme should make efficient use of land, which I think no one could argue that it doesn't. But it also says there that the density on the scheme needs to ensure it's sympathetic to local character. And personally, I'm not convinced that that's the case. I think that the parking provisions on the site, whilst it does actually have 2 spaces, are very tight to negotiate in and out of into those 2 parking spaces. And I also think that the issues around, for example, on page 41, references to surface water drainage being considered, and as a matter of judgment, not considered to give rise to an adverse effect. It doesn't sound particularly reassuring. On page 42.5, if during the course of development any unexpected land instability issues are found which are not identified, development shall be suspended. Well, that's obviously a good thing, but I'm not sure whether that's I would ask a question to the officers whether that's a standard approach, or whether that's been specifically added because of the complexities of the site. But all in all, it does feel that too much is being tried to be fitted into a small and difficult area, admittedly, and at the moment, I don't see that it meets the threshold for approval. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Barber. So just before we go to Councillor Barrett, who is next, there was a question there about the land instability condition and whether that's standard. Is there anybody who wants to?
Yeah, it's just a standard precautionary condition because of the physical site constraints in this case.
Okay. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Chair. And I think this is an interesting item in many ways. I know Councillor Barber's narrative in terms of it's certainly when you go back to the applications 20 plus years ago, they were certain beyond that there was no question of acceptability, and I think that provided. But there has been an interesting journey of getting better and getting worse. Actually, when we looked at historic applications, from my viewpoint. But I'm listening to the debate interestingly, but I am more minded, I think, on the side of actually, and others feel free to disagree with me, and I suppose it's a question of character and design, that the only thing from my experience that unites the properties of Hutton Mount is the really difficult nature of trying to find a letterbox when you're delivering a leaflet, let alone actually many other qualities. But it is certainly an eclectic environment. It certainly has some very high quality and interesting and innovative properties. And I think this could be complementary on a balance of my own opinion right now. I am still going to listen to what's happening. I'm sure Councillor Quirk and Chinnery and may be able to convince me of a different viewpoint. But for me, I think on balance right now, I disagree with the motion for refusal at this time because I think on balance this is an interesting design that potentially adds value to the area and actually wider Brentwood. And on a balance of the movement, the progress that's been made in this site, it fulfills the other legal requirements and challenges that we had. It's not a simple decision, and there certainly are challenges. Councillor Barber's quite point that the 2 parking spaces being very tight, but they are compliant. so there's not a reason to refuse. If it's something complies, it complies. So for me, on that basis, it is a question of do I think that this design adds value and merit, or does it challenge? And I think I am more in the value and merit camp at this moment. But I'd like to hear more, because I think it's an interesting situation. But I do, and actually, I welcome the fact that councillors are raising these interesting points and opinions and challenges, because that's a good thing for us to debate. But for me, that's where my mind is right now. But I'd like to hear more.
Okay. Councillor Gorton.
Thank you, Chair. At the moment, I'm not minded to support the motion to refuse this application. My views are similar to Councillor Gareth Barrett's. I think this is quite a bold and innovative application. It's an eco house, of which I think we have very few examples in the borough. I think most of the complaints and reasons for refusal for previous applications have been overcome. It's been stressed that it's a semi-subterranean dwelling. It's one story. It wouldn't overlook number 77, and it wouldn't be overlooked by the houses in Hanging Hill Lane. I do still have some concerns over parking and safety, safety of school children. I know, well, that wasn't addressed, that isn't addressed in the officer's report, as far as I can see. So, I'm generally in favour of this proposal, but I still have some concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gorton. We've had Councillor Mayo's indicated to speak, Councillor Quirk's indicated to come back. I think I'll just say a few things first. I think, as far as I'm concerned, the thought process that I went through actually started with paragraph 6.5 in the report, where it says that the principle of residential development on this site is accepted. There may be members of this committee, and I'm sure there are probably members of the public and ward councillors and neighbouring ward councillors who don't see the principle of residential development on this site as being accepted. But I think if you do see the principle of residential development on this site as being accepted, it's extremely difficult to imagine a proposal for this site which actually takes the site constraints and the site issues into account more than this application does. There's a frankly extraordinary trajectory from previous versions of previous applications on this site, and seeing those, you can see the kinds of problems they had, and you can see why they were being recommended for refusal, and why inspectors were saying the same thing. It's very obvious. There's been a very, very significant trajectory here. And I think the wording that was used by the applicant when the applicant spoke, to say that the refusals were used as a design brief, is exactly, I mean, that's what I could see when I was looking at this application. I can see that there are concerns. I very much hear, and I'm always very keen to listen to what local people are saying, and obviously the Hutton Mount Association in terms of their understanding of the area and their expectations of the kind of development that they would like to see in the area. Always very keen to listen to what people are saying who know their own area and respect their own area. But I think there's an interesting process here in terms of how you respect an area. We have an application here. Well, I mean, so we have a report which says that it's that it's positive in terms of BE14, and some councillors have said that it's not, obviously, it's by saying that it responds positively and sympathetically to its context, which is what BE14 is asking for. So does this site do that? We've also got NE07, and so, you know, the question is this a development where the form and the height and the layout of the development is appropriate to the surrounding pattern of development? Councillor Quirk raised that point, quoted those words. My view is that there's two ways of doing that. There's two ways of doing those two things. Either you propose something which is very, very similar to neighbouring buildings, and obviously in that case you can see that there's a sympathy to surroundings and there's a positive response to surroundings, and you can see that it's appropriate to the surrounding pattern of development. Or, and obviously in this case that's been tried, and in this case it doesn't work because of the nature of the plot and the problems of the plot and the way in which the plot is both overlooked and overlooks itself neighbours. So it does that approach doesn't work. So what's happened here is that the applicants accepted that that approach doesn't work and has looked at the other possibility, and the other possibility is to propose something which takes the full account of the site constraints and the impact on, and that includes impact on neighbour amenity, and is highly respectful of them in such a way as to try and negate all of the points that have been previously raised with the previous applications as reasons why they shouldn't be approved. And I think in terms of the design and the application itself on the plot, that's what I'm seeing is happening. And it's obviously what the design officer is seeing, and it's what the case officer is seeing as well. Now, let's just talk about school safety for a moment, because I mean that's a very important issue. In Brentwood North, which is my ward, we have Sawyershall Lane. We have, I think at the last count, 5 or 6 schools in Sawyershall Lane. We have massive traffic issues. We have cars doing all sorts of things. We have children spilling over onto the street. We have pavements which are too narrow for the children, people pushing buggies. I mean, there's all sorts of chaos, and it goes on every single day, and it's a massive problem, and it would be great if it could be resolved, but it's not being resolved. I'm looking at this situation and thinking, I wish the school children who go to the schools in my ward had a nice, quiet, dead-end road with a footpath at the end of it and no through traffic to get their way to school, because that's a much better situation than the situation that so many other school children in my ward and in other parts coming from various parts of Brentwood have when they come to various schools in this borough. I mean, I used to work for a period at Brentwood County High. I saw children crossing the mini roundabout at the top of Queen's Road. Obviously, barriers have been put up. People get irritated by barriers. They stand on the road side of the barrier with no space at all, and then run across the road when there's no cars coming, and you look at it and you think, I really wish you weren't doing that. This is the nature of school going, and those are very, very serious concerns, and those are problems, and again, it would be great if that wasn't happening. So in this location, I'm hearing concerns. I think the biggest concerns would certainly be to do with the development process. When the vehicles are coming backwards and forwards on site, when work is going on, there's clearly going to be issues, and there would clearly need to be somebody keeping a good eye of the kind of impact that would have on very large numbers of school children using that as a route to go to school, which obviously is what they do. So I can see that there are concerns, and I understand they're genuine, and obviously I don't think anybody in this room would wish there to be any particular danger to school children going to school. But I'm looking at that, and I'm measuring it against some of the other areas and the other things that I've seen happening, and thinking to myself, I can see the concern and I understand the concern, but it's not right up at the top level of potential dangers that I can see and have seen in Brentwood. So, as far as I'm concerned, the design we're being told is positive. I can see the progress. I can see that it's positive. From my point of view, I regard this as a site. I mean, I think this is an application which is unorthodox, it's original, and it's ingenious. Yeah, it's very, very unlike other stuff which is on Hutton Mount, and that's designed. It's very much designed. It's as a response to the problems with the site. So I see the positives. I certainly won't be voting in favour of a motion for refusal. The next person we have to speak is Councillor Mayor.
Thank you, Chair. I think half of what you said I was going to say, so I don't need to repeat that now. I had the same starting point as you in terms of I recognise the principle of residential development at the site is accepted is a key statement to me, and therefore I then looked at it in terms of, okay, but what could be developed on that site? Now, this has got a 20-year history. There's no question, looking through the history, looking through the inspector's reports, that every decision up to this point has been absolutely correct in my view, and I certainly would have refused all of those. However, I think this is almost the only scheme I could see that could tick enough boxes to actually be on this site. And from that perspective, I am minded certainly to vote against the refusal. I also would like to commend the officer for what is an incredibly clear report, very well set out, and also the follow-up site visit that we had on Saturday, which clarified several things in my mind, not least the overlooking issue. I personally feel that I think there will be some challenges, and therefore the conditions that are raised, Councillor Barber's already referenced 4 and 5, they are key. That gives me enough reassurance to think that the subsidence risk is at least mitigated in terms of what we can approve tonight. So my position at this point is I will be voting against refusal of this application.
Right, so I know Councillor Quirk wants to come back. I haven't actually got anybody else who's indicated to... Oh, Councillor Baldock, would you like to come in?
I agree with everything Councillor Mayo said. I think what this boils down to is, should anything be built there? Because I can't imagine anything being more acceptable than this. And we sit here and we go, we don't agree with this expert, we don't agree with that expert, but at the end of the day, the planning inspectorate tends to agree with the experts. So I would be cautious of saying we don't think that the drainage is okay, we don't agree with highways, and if we refuse it on those grounds, I think the planning inspectorate will just agree with the experts. So there's not a lot of point doing that. I think if we're going to say that we don't agree with this property being there at all, that seems to me the only route to take, because nothing else would be suitable here. So at the moment, I personally don't have a big problem with it.
Thank you, Councillor Baldock. I don't know if, just in terms of, we're obviously in a, well, it's been described, I think Councillor Hurst described it as a semi-rural location, which is an interesting way of describing it. Green though Hutton Mount is. I don't know if any officer would like to come in on the point about the principle of development on the site, whether it's Mr. Cook or...
Yeah, so my opinion is that the principle of development is acceptable because it is within a settlement. The point has previously been raised in appeal decisions. I was having a look at those again earlier today, and the inspector also said, I think it may be in the 2014 appeal, that the principle of residential development of the site was acceptable. So my view is it's in a relatively sustainable location. I've made that point within the report. You're, in my opinion, doing an on-the-ground assessment within walking distance of Shenfield Station. I think, again, in one of the appeal decisions, reading earlier, the inspector made the point that it was in a sustainable residential location. Yes, it's quite a leafy setting. That's the character of Hutton Mount. I wouldn't personally say it was semi-rural, but I understand the point that's being made. Does that satisfy that point? Yep. Is it all right if I can just go back on a couple of points that have been raised? I appreciate that people have been raising a concern about the safety of school children. I think what I need to just point out is that the Highway Authority have provided their input on this scheme and have raised no objection. They've previously made it clear that vehicles are travelling at quite slow speeds at this point. We can never fully mitigate the full effects of construction activity for any scheme, but what we are proposing in this case is a construction method plan that should help to help provide us information about exactly where vehicles will be parking during the construction phase, when deliveries will be taking place, fully aware of school times for St Martin's School and any other schools in the immediate vicinity. So, you know, a couple of those issues we think can be mitigated, and in my opinion, as I said earlier this evening, I don't think a reason for refusal could probably be substantiated on those grounds. In terms of previous appeal decisions, the key issues have been whether the impact upon the character and appearance of the area is acceptable and whether the living conditions of existing and future occupants are acceptable. They're the two key issues that have been raised previously on appeal. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think that's very helpful. Councillor Squirks.
Yeah, thanks, Chair, for the opportunity to come back. I just want to sum up a few things that I've heard, and just to kind of counter some of them, if I may. First of all, could we put the proposed elevations up on the screens? I noticed for the last half an hour or so, we've not actually been looking at what is proposed to be built. And I think in the context of design, whether it be good, bad or ugly, I think we should be looking at elevations in the context of what is being proposed. We have better elevations than that. I think we have some CGIs, don't we?
We just were on the CGIs for the property. So
No, but that was the previous applications that have been refused.
No, the thing that was just on screen was
Oh,
this
right, okay,
proposal.
fine. So my point's going to be that if you look at that elevation in the context of what is next to it and opposite, and I know, as the officer was just saying, in terms of design being subjective, I don't think anybody could possibly contend or agree that what is being proposed here, which is effectively a nuclear bunker, as far as I'm concerned, is in any way, shape or form in keeping with what is opposite or next door. So I know that there's a penchant for design being, you know, innovative, cool or whatever, but we specifically talked about BE14 as a policy whereby design has to be proper, appropriate, in keeping. There is absolutely no way you can say that that is in keeping with the Tudor-esque type properties adjacent or opposite. So that's my first point. Second point is we've heard from a number of councillors, and I have to say, some of them kind of struggling a little bit really to try and come up with reasons to approve this. Frankly, being bold and innovative and interesting are not things, gentlemen and ladies, of a planning merit. So I know that might be interesting, things might be bold, things might be innovative. They in themselves are not reasons to approve something. Moreover, and it has been raised over the last few minutes, that this is the best design that we can hope for on this site. We don't have to approve anything. That is what the planning committee is for, to decide if something should be developed at all. So the very fact that we're struggling to try and accept some kind of development on this site, which is what's been alluded to by Councillor Barrett and others, and Councillor Mayo, I think we need to take a kind of long, hard look at ourselves in terms of what our function as a planning committee is, because, you know, that is not what we are compelled to do. We're not compelled to have to give permission one way or the other just because there's an application in front of us. The other thing, principle of development. Can I just ask a question? Is this site in the local plan? Was it in the call for sites?
It's a Winfield site.
So it's not in our call for sites?
No, it's not in the call for sites, but it is within the settlement hierarchy 1, which is the most sustainable location within Brentwood.
Okay, but when we write a local plan, we accept the premise of putting proposed sites in that plan based on a call for sites, which therefore would cover what we would then believe post-plan, the appropriateness, the acceptability of sites being developed, and this is not in it.
No, it's not, but it doesn't prohibit from Winfield sites from coming forward other schemes being delivered.
Okay, and I have to go back to NE07. When you read NE07, it specifically talks about backland development being a presumption against development. That is what NE07 is, unless certain criteria are accepted and tests met. And again, one of those is appropriateness, whether it be amenity space, whether it be parking, whether it be design, whether it be being in keeping and appropriate with the surroundings. I'll go back to my first point. This is not appropriate and in keeping with its surroundings. It is backland development. This is a house being plonked in what was 2 gardens. It is not acceptable. I think that's my list. Hopefully I've covered pretty much everything that's just come up. I think there are clear and compelling reasons to support my motion for refusal. Slightly concerned that other members don't see it as clearly as others do, frankly.
Thank you, Councillor Quirk. I'm going to go to Karen Corrigan in just a moment. There's a couple of things I was going to say about that. It's interesting that you're characterising other councillors as struggling to come up with a line of reasons for approval when you attempt to argue that there shouldn't be any such thing as windfall sites. I mean, any normal planning application.
Oh,
you've had your say, Councillor Quirk. We have any number of windfall sites which come forward as not part of local plans, and single building applications. That's pretty much what windfall sites are. You wouldn't put those in the local plan. Windfall sites come forward all over the place and all the time, and the local plan itself expects windfall sites to come forward, so that's just normal planning development process. And the point about whether something should be on this site or not has already been answered by the officer, who's explained that the planning inspector has already said that the principle of development on this site is acceptable. So I don't think anybody who's talking in terms of possible approval here, and obviously we've got the motion for refusal first, is struggling. Anyway, Ms Corrigan.
Thanks, Chair. I'll just referring back to NE 07 and just caution about using that specific policy if there was a motion that was passed for refusal, in as much as that it states its opening line is proposals for development on sites that form part of an existing garden or group of gardens will only permitted where I would suggest that this land is no longer an existing garden. Might be there might be semantics, but I would just caution about using that NE 07, and then it goes on to say at 8.68, if designed appropriately, some forms of redevelopment and infill development, which this would be, will make efficient use of land and will continue to be a valuable additional source of housing supply. So just going back to the point that Darryl made earlier as a windfall site, so just that caution of if you're going to be citing NE 07, you might want to just think about whether you consider this an existing garden or group of gardens, and that windfall site part. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful. Councillor Barrett, did you want to come back?
Yes, you could, Chair. It's just to clarify, my comments are in the context of this is a motion to refuse. I need to hear motions, facts of why it should be refused and policy to be refused on. That was the framing of my comments and commentary. If there is a motion, if the motion for refuse falls, there's a motion of approval, then I will discuss reasons why I believe that this is policy compliant for approval, because that's the two-stage of the process, and as Councillor Quirk's new to the committee, that's how it works. And my caution on refusal, and it's actually Councillor Baldock made a similar kind of approach to it, is we have to have defendable reasons for refusal. I've heard NE 07 mentioned as one of the reasons. I think BE 14 potentially. They are NE 07. The officers noted that BE 14 is in itself subjective, so we have a subjective conversation. My subjective nature on this point, I think, is that I don't think I've moved from my earlier comments, but in terms of when we move to the, if there were to be a motion for approval put rather than potentially have a motion of deferral, then we would consider reason for refusal. This is the two-stage process of it. What policies mean we should refuse it, what policies, and then we go to what policies mean maybe we should accept it. That's how I work on these debates. I think framing them differently is very important. And my only other element to recognise, and officers can correct me in this, but our LDP requires a certain amount of windfall sites to hit our required number and our 5-year housing land supply. So the LDP, by its nature, requires a set quantum of windfall sites to be approved. So in that circumstance, it is considerable that if it is something considered a windfall site, it is an LDP site in that context. I think that's important to recognise, because otherwise we would just be stuck with those. If you're in there, you're available. If you're not, and that does change over time. And I think it's circa 60, 70 per year, but I may be wrong. But I don't quote me on that. But it is in the LDP if members would like to look and consider that. Thank you.
Councillor Barber, I just say.
It's just very quickly, I would, like Councillor Barrett, it would be very helpful to me to make my mind up if we could hear the exact policies and the aspect of each policy we are using for the refusal motion, because depending on that, my vote could go either way.
So Councillor Quirk, as the mover, your policies.
Yep, so contravention of BE14 may be subjective, but many of us seem to think that this, in terms of its appropriateness of scale, design, and it being in keeping, does not meet the test of being applicable and acceptable by way of BE14. NEO 7, actually, if we look at paragraph 612, the officer's report clearly says policy NEO 7 seeks to protect land for gardens and is considered to be applicable. That is exactly what the officer's report says in the first line. This, I believe, this recognises, therefore, that this is or was gardens. It's certainly not been designated, I don't think, as anything else in terms of its designation as a development site. It's not in the local plan, as we have heard. Just because we like windfall sites here and there doesn't mean that this itself is appropriate. So it contravenes NEO 7 and BE14.
Okay. Does any officer want to come in on comment on that, or we can go to the vote if they don't? You don't have to.
Chair, I think that's the whole point, that the officer should come back with a reply so that we actually have the officer response to the points that have been made. Then we've heard both sides.
Okay. An officer needs to speak. Go on.
What would you like for us to come back on?
On the points about B14 and NEO 7, I mean, we have covered it already, and I'm conscious we don't want to go round and round.
That's fine. I'll touch on overdevelopment, and then I'll hand over to Paulette, if that's all right. So I think we've had this before on overdevelopment, especially again, but I know you've spoken about scale and design, so I'll leave that with Paulette to address. But as we've heard before several times in the chamber, it's not defined. So it is taken to mean a form of intensity of development that results in unacceptable relationship with its surroundings, causing harm through excessive bulk scale, height or site coverage that erodes local character or fails to provide adequate space, landscaping or amenity, for example. So that's just the basis of your overdevelopment. So I'll pass over to Paulette to respond on scale, design, etc.
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. And what I want to make really clear to members is that in my professional opinion and from the assessment that I've made, that this isn't about bulk and scale. There are two contexts here. There's a micro context of the actual parcel itself, upon which the principle of development is acceptable. And then there is the quality of the street scene, and it's how the building is perceived there. And I think if we could go back to the letter, Chair, with your permission, what I'm saying is that it is a silent piece of architecture, and that's why the landscaping is so important, because the overriding character of this thoroughfare is verdant, and that's possibly where we've been talking about the term sort of semi-rural has come in, is because it does have that feeling because of its verdant quality. Now, scale is something that is impactful, that you can see. That would be more than one story. And that, as I think we all are aware, is where the problems were happening with the previous applications. So my advice to the RPA is that this wouldn't engage issues with design, albeit that this is a silent architecture and it's not a pastiche of any other architecture on the estate. It's standing on its own merit. And again, I draw members to National Planning Policy paragraph, which this is a piece of good architecture in our opinion. That doesn't result in material harm to the character of the location. Thank you.
Okay, right. So we've had a motion for refusal moved and seconded. We've had the explanations for the reason why that's been moved. We've had the officer response. I think we can go to the vote on the motion for refusal.
Thank you, Chair. Would members please indicate for or against the motion when their name is called? Councillor Minot.
Against.
Councillor M. Cuthbert.
Against.
Councillor Baldock. Councillor Barber.
For.
Councillor G. Barrett.
Against.
Councillor N. Cuthbert. Councillor Chinnery. Councillor Gorton.
Against.
Councillor Mayo.
Against.
Councillor Patel.
Abstain.
Councillor Quirk. Thank you. The motion to refuse the application is lost. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Right. So on the back of that motion being lost, I'm happy to move a motion for approval of this. Councillor Hurst, you've had your opportunity to speak. Unfortunately, non-planning committee members don't get the chance to speak once the planning committee get going. It would be useful sometimes if non-planning committee members, non-planning committee speakers could speak, but that's the way it works. So I'm happy to move this for approval. And I would just like to say a couple of things really quickly, because we've had a good discussion already, I think. First of all, I think the description Verdon is a very, very good description. Hutton Mount is a precious area in terms of the Brentwood urban area. It's got a strong character of its own, and it's got a character which I certainly wouldn't want to see disrupted on any fundamental level. I think it's very important and it needs looking after. I do think this application, once we're being told that this site is acceptable for development, it's very, very difficult to see how you could improve on this application, on this site, in order to try and solve the problems which we have seen and which have been expressed in the past. So I think that's very, very important. And, you know, just to say to the neighbours, to the Hutton Mount Association, certainly listening to you, there's an interesting diversity of built form on Hutton Mount. Certainly there isn't anything exactly like this, but then it is responding to the specific plot that it's on. I've already explained why I think it's worth moving this or worth taking a view that this is an acceptable application, which is what the officer's report says. I also think it's an extremely well-written report and answers a lot of points and makes a lot of things very clear, and I think that's very helpful. So do I have a seconder for a motion of approval?
Second that, Chair, and reserve my right to speak or speak depending on where we are.
So we obviously now, we could go around the houses again. We've had quite a lot of discussion already. Has anybody got anything new that hasn't already been said in the discussion that we had on the motion for refusal that they would like to come in on? Because they can do that now. Well, there's various things that I'm sure people would like clarifying. As I say, Councillor Hurst, unfortunately, you can't interject into the process once the planning committee is speaking. That's the frustration of it. Whatever the thing is that you need clarifying, we'll obviously have to have some explanation afterwards, unfortunately. So does any member of the committee want to speak on the motion for approval, or should we just go to the vote on the motion for approval? Okay, I'm not seeing anybody who wants to speak. So we can go to the vote on the motion for approval, which has been moved and seconded.
Would members please indicate for or against the motion when their name is called? Councillor Minot.
For.
Councillor M. Cuthbert.
For.
Councillor Baldock.
For.
Councillor Barber.
Against.
Councillor G. Barrett.
For.
Councillor N. Cuthbert.
For.
Councillor Chinnery.
Against.
Councillor Gorton.
For.
Councillor Mayo.
For.
Councillor Patel.
Against.
Councillor Quirk. Thank you. The motion to approve is carried. Thank you, Claire.
Right, thank you for that. So we have concluded that, we've approved that application. Anybody who's here just for that application and doesn't want to be here for the second one, you have the opportunity to leave the room. We'll have a very brief pause. We'll just have a 5-minute loo break. Oh, okay, everybody. Right. We'll move on to item 4, which is obviously completely backwards, but that's where we are. Item 4 is next, and item 4 is 15 Coleridge Walk in Hutton. And this is an application for a part single, part two-storey side extension, single-storey rear extension, demolition of porch, replace porch canopy. This is application number 25/01187/HHA with the recommendation for approval, and the case officer is Ms Georgia Taylor. Ms Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. Agenda item 4 is for 15 Coleridge Walk, Hutton, and the proposed development seeks to construct a part 2, part single-storey side extension, single-storey rear extension, and the demolition of the existing porch and construction of a replacement porch and porch canopy. The application was called into committee by ward member Councillor Chinnery. The application site is located on the southern side of Coleridge Walk, and the site is set at the end of the cul-de-sac which borders with Hanging Hill Lane. The application dwelling comprises of a semi-detached two-storey dwelling which benefits from an original two-storey rear projection and a single-storey lean-to rear extension. The application site boundaries also join onto the rear gardens of Hanging Hill Lane and Larkin Close. On the screen above there are some site photographs which show the existing dwelling along with the adjoining neighbour number 14 Coleridge Walk, and there are also some site photos from the rear of the dwelling which shows the shared common boundary with the neighbouring dwellings at number 195 and 197 Hanging Hill Lane. Again, shown on the above screen, there's some more photographs which clearly shows the existing spatial gap between the flank elevation and the boundary with Hanging Hill Lane. The proposed development seeks to construct a front porch canopy and a part 2, part single-storey side extension and single-storey rear extension. The proposed front porch canopy would have a depth of 900 millimetres with a pitch roof design and a maximum height of 3.2 metres. The proposed side and rear extensions would have a width of 3.5 metres at ground floor level and a width of 3.2 metres, which then reduces to 1.9 metres towards the rear at first floor level. The proposed extensions would wrap around the western flank elevation of the existing dwelling, and although do not protrude beyond the existing rear elevation, have also been set back from the front building line by 520 millimetres at ground level and 2.6 metres at first floor level. The proposed roof design for the proposed part 2, part single-storey side extension and the rear extensions have a single-storey monopitch roof design at the front which wraps around the western flank elevation, also retaining the monopitch design towards the rear. And at first floor, the two-storey element will be set down 780 millimetres below the ridge height of the host dwelling with a maximum height of 7.6 metres and a hipped roof design. This current application is a resubmission following the refusal of the 2 above applications, with the second application having been dismissed at appeal. Following the appeal, a pre-application was sought prior to the resubmission of this current application. The differences between the first 2 applications were minimal, as shown above on the elevational drawings. Since the recent dismissed appeal in February of 2025, the scheme was further reduced, mostly at first floor level, to reduce the depth, width and bulk. In addition, a change in roof design was proposed to reduce the bulk and scale the scheme when viewed from Hanging Hill Lane. The proposed development has been significantly reduced since the original submission under 24-00521-HHA. The current proposal has reduced the width at both ground and first floor levels, significantly reduced the depth of the development at first floor level, and also reduced the height of the extension and introduced a hip roof design. The proposed accumulation of extensions would now be read as a more subordinate extension to the host dwelling and provides a better spatial gap between the development to Hanging Hill Lane and Coleridge Walk. There's a table on the screen just showing the differences between the 3 applications. The most notable changes since the original submission are the reduction in width from 4 metres at 2-storey level to 3.5 metres at ground floor level and 3.2 metres at first floor level. Originally, the extension was set flush with the front elevation at 2-storey level, and it is now proposed to be set back 520 millimetres at ground floor level and 2.6 metres at first floor level. The ridge height of the proposed extension originally extended from the main ridge height of the application dwelling and has now been set down 780 millimetres with a height of 7.6 metres. The original proposed extension also sought a gable end roof design, and the current proposal seeks a hipped roof design. The original submission also sought a first floor flat roof extension towards the rear, and this has now been changed to a hipped roof design. The original submission sought a first floor flat roof extension towards the rear with a width of 4 metres, and the current proposal has reduced the width of this first floor extension to 1.9 metres. And the first floor flank facing windows have all been labelled as obscure glazed on the drawings proposed. The current scheme also shows a visual comparison between the three applications to visualise the reduction in footprint of the proposed development. In terms of neighbouring dwellings, the current scheme has set the first floor element of the development 3.7 metres from the shared common boundary shared with number 195 and 197 Hanging Hill Lane. The height of the extension has been reduced to 7.6 metres high, consistent with a two-storey building and a hipped roof design. The inspector for the second application did not previously identify any overbearing effects to the detriment of the neighbouring properties. This scheme is materially smaller in terms of scale, massing and height. Therefore, there would continue to be an acceptable impact upon the amenities of the neighbours. The slide illustrates the orientation of the site, the rear garden towards the south and the sun's path. The first floor element may result in a degree of shading during the morning, but as time passes, shadowing effects from the extension would be set away from numbers 193 to 197 to the west. The proposed development also provides 2 off-street parking spaces which are set to the western side of the proposed extension. The proposed off-street parking provisions will be in line with the current parking guidance, and the Highway Authority have raised no objection. The proposal is recommended for approval subject to conditions. The proposed development has taken into consideration the main issues raised within the recent appeal and has made design alterations which have reduced the overall bulk, scale and massing through the proposed alterations and would be more appropriate to the context of the street scene. Development would not cause detrimental or material harm to the amenity and living conditions of the occupiers of the neighbouring residential occupiers, and the proposed development has been recommended for approval. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Ms Taylor. Right, so I don't, on this, do we have a version of this that says we have any speakers? We don't have any speakers on this. That's just, give me the piece of paper and I'll, okay, thank you. Okay, applicant or agent, Katie Smith. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, councillors. As you'll be aware, this is the 4th planning application proposing extensions to this family home. The last application was withdrawn to facilitate discussions with your planning officers to develop the scheme and overcome their concerns regarding previous designs. We thank your officers for their engagement, which has resulted in this application of considerably reduced scale and bulk and their positive recommendation for approval. The property was purchased 2 years ago by the applicants, who saw potential to renovate the 2-bedroom dilapidated cottage, which is damp and prone to mould, to provide a home for their planned family. As addressed within your office's report, the proposal has been reduced in scale to respond to concerns regarding the scale and bulk of the extension previously, and proposes a considerably reduced scheme while still providing a 3-bedroom family home, facilitating renovation of the dwelling, improving its street appearance and ensuring that windows, heating and insulation are all upgraded to meet the improved sustainability requirements of modern buildings. The extensions would now have a substantially lower ridge height than the host dwelling and be stepped back from the front elevation, appearing subservient within the street scene. Neighbouring residents have raised concerns. With regard to parking, 2 spaces are provided in accordance with the 2024 Essex parking standards and to the satisfaction of the local highway authority. With regard to sunlight, the siting of the extension is such that there would be no direct loss of sunlight to neighbouring properties. There is no validation requirement for a daylight assessment, and in a situation where it's clear that there would be no obstruction to the sun path, there is no practical need for assessment either. Right to light, also raised as a civil matter separate to material planning considerations. However, regardless of that, it's not anticipated that there would be any breach of this legislation. Concern raised regarding the use of obscure glazing within the side elevation is noted, and the applicant confirms they intend for all windows in the side elevation, both at first and ground floor level, to be obscure glazed, and are happy to accept such a condition. With regard to potential for the proposed water butts to attract mosquitoes, these are These are attracted to areas of stagnant open water. The water butts will be enclosed, and again, if desired by members, details of the water butts could be controlled by a planning condition, but the applicants confirm they are seeking to deliver a family home and would not wish to entice mosquitoes into their garden. The revised proposal retains the prominence of a pair of semi-detached dwellings, with the extension stepping back and down so as not to compete visually. As the planning inspector noted previously, the renovation of the existing dwelling, the re-rendering, general improvements and planting of the garden to deliver biodiversity enhancements are all positives of the proposal. The revised scheme now accords with local plan policy BE 14 by providing a high quality, safe, attractive, inclusive, durable and healthy place to live, responding positively to local context and safeguarding the living conditions of future occupiers and neighbouring residents. The applicants thank you for listening and giving their application your due consideration this evening. We hope that you welcome the changes that have been made in response to previous concerns and feel able to vote in favour of approval. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, so we don't have any objectors listed to speak. We have two of the three ward councillors here. And Councillor Chinnery, obviously you referred this, so you have the opportunity to go first.
Thank you, Chair, and I believe because I've referred and have implied an opinion, I won't be able to vote this evening. But thank you, Chair. I believe strongly that this application should be moved and refused on the basis of BE 14, which is something we've talked lots about. And a quote from the previous application was the unacceptable relationship with its surroundings. That came to mind and that stuck with me because the objections from neighbours all surrounding this development are all in opposition, are all suggesting refusal, and that just to me implies that it does not comply with BE 14 of the local development plan. I understand it's very subjective, but if you look at those elevations, the property is still considerably bigger. The floor plans look enormous compared to number 14 Coleridge Walk. And I know as you debate this, you will probably be debating BE 14, but I believe strongly that this application still, and I recognise it's an improvement from the big white elephant from about a year ago, is still not in compliance with that. And I want to underpin two further points. I am doubtful about this application's compliance with BE 13 of the local plan parking provision. Coleridge Walk is a narrow cul-de-sac, it's at a tight end, and residents have complained in previous applications and have said to me they still consider the parking to be a material issue because the conversations with the Highways Authority were considered to be very informal, and I think in the decision, I think maybe more conversation should have been had with the Highways Authority over the suitability of the parking provision. And in relation to the Hanging Hill Lane residents who are objecting to this, I believe NEO 7 parts B and C, I believe there could be still grounds for refusal there. But I accept and I agree the easiest way to say we need to refuse this application, and I encourage you to refuse this application, is B 14.5.126, because it's blatantly obvious to me, the residents of Coleridge Walk, that this development at the moment has an unacceptable relationship with its surroundings. I don't think I need to say much more than that. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Just before we go to Councillor Rigby, could we possibly get up an image of the layout of the plots? The plots as a whole, I think, because it is the relationship between, well, that's better than just the wording that we had. I think it's useful to have something visible on the screen. We can potentially change it something else if somebody wants. Councillor Rigby.
Thank you, Chair. I sustain and agree with all of the submissions made by Councillor Chinnery, unequivocally. I don't believe that this should be approved. I have the same concerns as he has in relation to the bulk scale and massing of the revised extension. I acknowledge that there has been a historic process here by which the applicant has worked through successive applications, not all of them successful, and has arrived at a position where they've made use of the pre-application facility to discuss it with officers, and that there has been progress, but that progress is neither sufficient or comprehensive enough for me to support this. I place considerable weight on the views of the residents. They have been adequately summarised by the officer here, but I think they bear close reading, and I would urge the committee members to read them. I'm afraid there's just not enough here, substantially or considerably, for me to approve this, and I won't be doing so.
Thank you, Councillor Rigby. Councillor Quirk.
Thank you, Chairman. A couple of questions, if I may. Can you explain what the difference in square footage is, both in terms of the existing dwelling and what's proposed, but also the difference between the existing dwelling and what was proposed and refused previously? So in other words, what's the square footage of the existing dwelling? What are we proposing here? What is the applicant proposing here in terms of that percentage uplift? And how different is that to the first and second refused applications? Just to give us an idea of context, please.
I don't have sort of numerical data on that with me to know what the square footage is between each of the applications. But obviously, I think you can see from the floor plans that were on the screen that have now disappeared. That you can see that there has been a significant change sort of in terms of the floor space at first floor level. There has been a width reduction between the first application, which was originally 4 metres in width, which is the same size as the original post dwelling, and the current scheme is now 3.5 metres at ground floor and 3.2 metres at first floor. But unfortunately, I don't have the square footage details.
So I guess what I'm trying to get to is, what is the percentage increase in what is being proposed here by way of the extension? Because if you go back to the floor plan, if you don't mind, so the site plan effectively to show the house next door, the volume that seems to be being proposed, I mean, if I was to do this on the back of a fag packet, I mean, that looks like a 60 or 70% increase in the size of the dwelling. Would that be about right? Would we agree with that, do we think? Yeah. That's 60 or 70% bigger, not just in existing, but also insofar as the house next door and next door to that and next door to that, which kind of brings me not quite to a conclusion yet, because I'm still thinking about this, and I'm sure there's lots of other people that want to speak, but the spectre of BE14, again, on the basis that if that is a 60% increase in size, I mean, it would be like a house on Hutton Mount adding 3,000 square feet by way of a comparison. So it is maybe not sizable in terms of actual volume, but in terms of percentage uplift in size, which obviously will be part of its mass, part of its scale, that will be seen from outside. This, in relative terms, is a big extension, isn't it?
I don't have any percentage increase calculations with me either, but I think if you could see it on the block plans, you can see that this section is sort of the first floor. Obviously, I know what you mean in terms of its sort of surrounding, but the site does already have this existing protrusion here, and this is already existing here, single story. It would just be sort of joining onto it, so it wouldn't be extending any further than it already does. In terms of that existing projection, which this house also has, and this single story projection, which number 14 also has as well. So it is mainly sort of, this is single story, this is single story, and this is obviously the first floor, but obviously that section essentially is existing.
You're finished, Councillor, for the moment.
Well, yeah, I'd love to have that percentage in terms of, you know, if the existing house is 800 square feet and the extension is 400 square feet, it's a 50% uplift. So do we know the latter? Do we know in terms of the proposed total first and ground floor plan, what the total square foot of that is. I mean, I don't expect you to sit there working it out, forgive me, but we don't have that on a plan from the architect at all then? Because we talked about, 3.2 by 3.5 and reduction versus the second application and so on. But it would still be very helpful to me in terms of understanding what the uplift here is, what the proposal is in terms of the overall square footage. Because I can kind of guess what the existing square footage is. It's about 800 or 900 square feet for a property of that nature. But I think if we're talking here about appropriateness and scale, mass, everything that relates to BE14, I think we kind of need to know that, because in relation here to those other three properties that are of identical design, it looks massive.
I'm hearing that we do have an answer to the question, which is also a question, by the way, that I wanted an answer to. So.
Just on a quick calculation of the floor plans as original ones proposed for this specific application, I haven't gone back to others. The original footprint is 53 square metres and the proposed footprint is 108 square metres. So it is in effect double of the existing, but what you need to be thinking about really is the visual impact of the built form, the elevations, how does that compare in relation to the neighbouring properties? Obviously what they're proposing here is set down from the ridge of the existing building. That overcomes one of the concerns the inspector had previously raised. The massing has been set back, so it's not as visually perceptible from immediately standing in front of the property, because it's kind of further back. You're not going to see it from as many views. So they're the kind of things you need to be thinking about. I wouldn't just rely specifically on the numerical difference between the existing and proposed.
But it is certainly it's useful to have those kinds of figures to get our heads around the overall effect and the overall, I mean, bulk scale and massing has already been mentioned. Bulk scale and massing was one of the reasons that was being given by the inspector as a reason not to accept the appeal. And, from a layperson's point of view, it's quite useful to have figures of that kind. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Chair. And actually, thank you for Councillor Quirk. It's been quite an interesting and useful contribution in that sense. In turn, when I look at this, I think the officer has mentioned it, but I also look at the context of the plot of land that it's in and land utilisations. I think that's an important factor to realise. It came from the previous item. Is it appropriate? I look at this, and it's a really quite large plot that isn't necessarily utilised to its full effect. And from my perspective, a more successful utilisation is a positive thing. Creating more rooms in existing land rather than developing new homes is in turn a positive thing for us to do. I think it's been useful to see the progress over various applications, recognising the limit of acceptability and the progress made, and the work that the applicant's done with our planning officers to find something that is more acceptable. And from my position, I think that balance has been crossed and it's reached the point of acceptability. So I'd like to propose this for approval if I have a seconder. Thank you.
So Councillor Barrett's moved for approval. Councillor Barber is happy to second that. Do you want to say anything else, Councillor Barrett?
Not at this stage, Chair. Thank you.
So if we go to Councillor Barber.
Thank you, Chair. I'll keep it brief. I think I'd like to thank the applicant for the presentation. I do think this has been improved to a state where I have no hesitation supporting the application that's come forward. I think the change in the roof line is much to be acknowledged and appreciated. I think the reduction in some of the measurements has made it more appropriate in terms of scale and bulk, and I cannot see any reason on planning terms to vote against this application.
Thank you, Councillor Barber. Councillor Mayor.
Yes, I had a site visit with 2 or 3 colleagues on Saturday, which actually helped me a great deal to understand the context of this site. And I back up what Councillor Barrett has said. I mean, I actually looked at the context of the other houses in the street, but specifically the plot itself. I could see that it would be accommodated, in my view, comfortably and with car parking. Also, I am not convinced there's a huge impact on the houses in Hanging Hill Lane, and actually the sunlight indicator there actually helps further on that matter. But crucially, I think it's a great advert for the pre-application process, and frankly, having looked at the history, I think the applicant may have saved some time by if they'd gone straight to that, and then we've got something that the officers feel is compliant. The report is very clear, and thanks again to the officer for that, and on that basis I'm very happy to approve it as well.
Councillor Gorton.
Thank you, Chair. I'm largely in agreement with the last three speakers. I think there's been an incremental improvement in the design of this extension. The original proposal, which would have doubled the width of the frontage and would have had a gable end facing the houses in Hanging Hill Lane, was clearly unacceptable. That's been modified so that the frontage is set back and at ground floor level, and set back yet again, set back further at first floor level, and at first floor level on the flank side, on the side wall facing Hanging Hill Lane, the first floor is set back from the ground floor, but the main change is from the gable end to a hip roof, which to my mind makes this acceptable. Thank you.
Right. Is there anybody else who was indicating to speak who hasn't yet spoken? No? Okay. Just one small question. On the images that we've seen, there was a proposal, the explanation of the car parking arrangements were that you'd have two cars parked, one in front of the other, between what's being proposed and the boundary line. And the maximum width there is 3.7 metres. And obviously highways are not raising objection, but they are talking in terms of there being off-street parking which shall have dimensions in accordance with the current parking standards and shall be retained in the agreed form at all times. I'm assuming that the 3.7 metres and I mean, it obviously narrows as we get further up, thanks, that's a useful image. That is abiding by what highways are asking for, which is off-street parking, which is the acceptable size. Mike.
Sorry, that the sizing is acceptable. I think it's 5 metres by 2.5 metres, which is the usual dimensions for the off-street parking provisions, and they've agreed that there's no objection to the spaces provided on the drawings shown.
Okay, yeah. I have to say, I mean, I was one of the people who, we went out a little stand on the pavement, because you don't really need a site visit on this one. You can see what's going on by standing on the pavement, and it's certainly very informative to see that. And I have to say, I've got a lot of sympathy. I've got a lot of sympathy for the applicants, because this is an improved scheme, definitely improved on previous versions, and it's very welcome to see that. I've certainly also got a lot of sympathy for the houses on Hanging Hill Lane who are going to be affected by this, because particularly when you stand on the site and from the images that we've had in front of us, you can see how very close the backs of those properties come to the common boundary. And so it's obvious to see that there will be a significant degree of, well, the experience for those people is hardly going to be a very welcome experience. So, and I can understand why there will be concerns about pretty much anything which is done on the side of this property. And we're also obviously in a situation where it is quite a large expansion, as Councillor Quirk's question has established, and Mr. Cook's answers has very helpfully given us the detail on that. So I have to say, my stance on this, I've regarded this one as being close to the line in terms of positives and negatives. I could see both positives and negatives. We do, however, have a motion for approval, which has been seconded. And if nobody else wants to speak, then I think we can go to the motion if nobody else is putting forward anything that they need to say. As I say, personally, I've got a lot of sympathy for the neighbours and the way the impact will come on them. One of the other problems I've got, the fact that I have that sympathy, I'm also noting the fact that we, as various versions of the scheme moved forwards, we're being told there were issues with the bulk and the massing and the height and the width of things in the past, but the concerns about the effects on the neighbours were something that was effectively being downplayed by the planning inspectors at earlier points. So it would be very difficult to build up an argument at this stage to say that the impact on the amenity of the neighbours was sufficient to do anything other than approve it. So that line of thought and that approach in terms of the previous comments by inspectors has been more or less headed off, which I think is a concern, and I'm sure those are the concerns that Councillors Chinnery and Councillor Rigby have expressed as ward councillors and as representatives of the neighbours. So as I say, I also have those concerns. But we have a motion for approval, which has been seconded, and we will go to that motion.
Thank you, Chair. Would members please indicate for or against the motion when their name is called? Councillor Minot.
Abstain.
Councillor M. Cuthbert.
For.
Councillor Baldock.
Abstain.
Councillor Barber.
For.
Councillor Gareth Barrett.
For.
Councillor N. Cuthbert. Councillor Gorton. Councillor Mayo. Councillor Patel. Councillor Quirk.
Yes.
Councillor Rigby.
Yes.
Thank you. The motion to approve is carried.
Right, that concludes the discussion of item 4. We have no urgent items, and therefore we have come to the end of tonight's planning meeting. Thank you everybody for attending.